Barry Harris has one rule for practice that turns your boring scale exercises into real jazz lines. And once I learned this at a masterclass, the exercises finally made sense and I could turn them into music in my solos. So in this video, I'm going to show you the Barry Harris rule that's helped thousands of my students and how it can finally make your solos sound like real jazz. Let me show you the difference between practicing notes and practicing jazz, because you don't practice scales to get better at scales, you practice to get better at jazz. Now, of course, the basic scales still matter, so here's a C major scale. But here's where a lot of players lose years. They grind exercises that are great for the fingers, but don't show up as real lines, like this classic 4-note grouping. Be honest, when was the last time you heard a great jazz guitarist play this exact pattern and it actually sounded like a phrase? Now here's how Barry Harris would practice. Start with something that already sounds like real music. He would literally hear a phrase and go, this sounds great, I'm going to make this into an exercise. So the test is simple. Would you actually play it in a solo? If not, it might build your technique, but it won't build your jazz vocabulary. Now instead, take something that you actually hear in solos, like this short Charlie Parker lick. It's almost a scale run, but with a twist in the middle. That drop and leading note in the middle is the magic. That's what makes it sound like a line instead of just a scale run. Now we do the Barry thing. We turn that phrase into an exercise. Start it on each note of the C major scale and listen to how many of these already sound like real vocabulary. And by the way, this drop and leading note phrase is also all over Grant Green's playing. Here's why this process works. You're building vocabulary, rhythm, phrasing, and technique all at the same time. Now that you've got the rule, here's the real question. How do you turn this into something that you can practice every day? Let me show you my simple 3-step process. Most players practice arpeggios every day, and arpeggios are great, but if you only drill them up and down, they rarely show up in your solos as real lines. So here's my simple 3-step process to turn a very simple arpeggio into vocabulary that really sounds like music. Step 1, turn the arpeggio into a phrase. So here are the basic arpeggios of C major, the way most people practice them. Here's the basic C major 7 arpeggio. Now let's upgrade it into something that you could actually play in a solo. We're going to keep the arpeggio, and then maybe add an enclosure around the first note. Turn the arpeggio into a triplet, and then add a scale note afterward, so that we have a bit more rhythm and direction. Next, step 2, move the phrase through the key. So now we do the exercise part. Keep the exact same idea, but start it on each note of the scale as we move through C major. So it becomes diatonic arpeggios. Now the notes change as we move, but the recipe stays the same. So the first phrase is this. So the recipe is, first we have the enclosure around the root, then the arpeggio as a triplet, and then that scale note. Now for the next note in the scale, the D, just start with the same idea. So first you get an enclosure, and note that we have that chromatic note under the D, so E to C sharp to D. Then the arpeggio as a triplet, and a scale note. That gives you... First, you want to just go through the scale slowly to find out where everything is and how to play it. Just pause between each one and don't worry about tempo. Gradually, you can turn it into this exercise. If you want the written version of this so you don't have to memorize it off the video and you can practice it at your own pace, grab the free PDF. There's a link in the description. Okay, step 3. Use it in your own lines. The most important part is using it in real playing. And at this point, this is already a usable lick. So now let's hear it in a 2-5-1 progression, using it on a D minor 7 and the upper octave version on the C major 7. The phrase is shifted to B2 on D minor 7. So we first have just F and D, and then we get the enclosure and then the arpeggio. And this actually makes it sort of naturally connect to the G7 because we're ending on the B, the third of the G7 on the forehand. And on the C major 7, the upper octave version fits perfectly coming out of the G7. Now here's a bonus way to get even more out of this exercise. Use the arpeggio from the third. On D minor 7, if you play the diatonic arpeggio on the third, which is F, so you have a D minor 7, that's D, F, A, C, now the third is F. The diatonic arpeggio on that note is an F major 7. So it's the same sound, almost the same notes, but now you've got that E, which is the 9th on D minor 7, and that's just a great color to add. So listen to how this F major 7 phrase sounds on the D minor 7, and then what happens when we do the same idea on C major 7 using an E minor 7 arpeggio as the arpeggio from the third. Did you hear how great that E minor 7 phrase sounded over C major 7? Now that's the same principle. E minor 7 is the arpeggio from the third of C major 7. So practicing like this gives you great sounding vocabulary that you can use across multiple chords, not just one shape in one place. Now let's do it with a real lick, because this is where your practice starts to really sound like a solo. You've seen the process with arpeggios. Now let's do the exact same thing with a real piece of vocabulary, a super short Charlie Parker lick. Here it is on C major 7. I'm gonna explain how it works when you've heard it. Now this is the C major 7 version. It's about 2 chord tones, E moving down to C, and Parker connects them with an enclosure into the C. That's this melody, B, D to C. And notice how this already sounds more like a real melody. It's not just a scale run, but most people don't practice little phrases like this as exercises. Step 1, now we already have the lick. Let's keep it in C because that's just easier to think, and then I'm gonna move it down an octave because then it's gonna be easier to move it through the scale. Step 2, move it through the scale. So now we start the same idea on each note of the scale as you move through C major. Now you already know the first one. Now for the next target note, the D, we start on F, and then we add that enclosure around the D. So that's C sharp, E to D. And yes, the C sharp is outside the scale, and that's on purpose. It is the chromatic below note that sort of really gets us to that D. And like this, you can go through the scale and get this exercise. Step 3, turn it into your own licks. So this is the fun part. Don't just repeat it, use it. Here is a longer line over a C major 7, and notice how I use the phrase and then I just keep on going up in the arpeggio. Super easy, barely an inconvenience. And once you've got a couple versions under your fingers, you can start mixing them. So here's a complete 2-5-1 lick, and listen on the C major 7 for the arpeggio from the third bonus. Did you catch that on the C major 7? Now, because this is chord tone based, then we can use the arpeggio from the third trick. So over C major 7, I'm actually using the E minor 7 version of the phrase. I'm starting on the G and then the enclosure around the E. Now the other place that this phrase shows up is at the beginning of the D minor 7 line. And because it just flows naturally, I just let that become the root note in the D minor 7 arpeggio. Remember that if you want the tabs for the 2-5-1 lick and the Parker exercise, I added them to the same free PDF. There's a link in the description. Okay, now you've got 2 ways to build vocabulary, from arpeggios and from a real lick. But here's where this becomes actual improvising. We're going to take the exercise and plug it into a real progression, a 2-5-1. So it starts sounding more like a solo and not just an exercise. Now let's take that Parker lick and insert it where you'll actually use it over a 2-5-1 in C major. So here are 3 basic versions, 1 for each chord. Next is the 5 chord, the G7. And finally, the 1 chord, C major 7. Now, of course, it's important to practice this in time so that you start hearing it in the music and how it's actually supposed to sound. This is how vocabulary starts showing up in your solos automatically, and already from just this, you can create a solid line. Notice how the G7 version is shifted by an 8th note. That little rhythmic displacement gives it a bit of extra bebop flavor. If you want my help turning exercises into real lines inside songs, so you're not guessing what to practice next, that's exactly what we do in my roadmap course. I'm going to show you what to practice, how to apply it to standards, and you can get feedback on your progress in the course community. There's a link in the description. Okay, bonus tip. If you want this to sound even more like jazz with almost no extra work, here's the from the third version. From the third really just means build the same phrase starting on the third of each chord. And I keep the same sound and they're still solid licks. Doing this gives us one of my favorite sounds on the D minor 7. So on D minor 7, the third is F. So the from the third phrase is the F version. On the G7, then the third is B, so you get this version. And of course, finally, over the C major 7, the third is E, giving you this. And of course, now you want to take that through the 2-5-1. And the best part is that you can connect this to your other lines really easily, especially that F phrase over D minor 7. Listen to how perfectly it sits on the chord. So that's the whole idea. Music first, exercise second. Build a phrase, move it through the key, then plug it into a progression so it becomes real vocabulary. And if you want the simplest version of this, something you can practice today that immediately shows up in your solos, your next step is Triad. Check out this video. It is one of the fastest ways to get that real jazz sound, something that's all over classic jazz solos, Joe Pass, Wes, Benson, everywhere. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.